Good afternoon, and welcome to this issue forum titled Cost Efficiencies of Defined Benefit Pension Plans. My name is Luke Martell, and I'm a program manager at the National Conference of State Legislatures, and it's my pleasure to moderate the session. You may have noticed the lights and the riser and the camera in the back of this room. Please be advised that NCSL is live streaming this program at the NCSL website, and it will later be archived by the Ohio channel, and it will also be added to NCSL's YouTube channel following the NCSL Legislative Summit. As states seek out more cost-effective ways to manage their public pension plans, they need solid information about price tags. Today, we'll ask whether defined benefit plans provide a better bang for the state's pension benefit buck, or whether defined contribution plans deliver comparable retirement income at the same cost. As we talk about the relative economic efficiencies of various plan designs, we'll factor in key developments in the retirement benefits landscape with respect to fees, investment strategies, and annuities. Our first presenter, we are pleased to welcome Diane Oakley, the Executive Director of the National Institute on Retirement Security. Before joining NERS, Ms. Oakley served as the Senior Policy Advisor to Congressman Earl Pomeroy of North Dakota. Prior to her service on Capitol Hill, Ms. Oakley held a number of management, public policy, and technical positions with TIAA-CREF during her 28-year tenure at that organization. She holds a BS in mathematics from Fairfield University and an MBA in finance from Fordham University. Following Ms. Oakley, our second speaker is Mr. Josh McGee. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and is also the Vice President of Public Accountability at the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. Dr. McGee has served as adjunct faculty member at Rice University, where he has taught in the Rice Education Entrepreneurship Program at the Jones Graduate School of Business. His research spans a number of important areas, including retirement policy, K-12 education, and economic development. He holds a BS and an MS in industrial engineering and a PhD in economics from the University of Arkansas. Once we have heard each of our experts, we invite you to ask questions. And you may have noticed the yellow index cards on your tables. NCSL staff will be collecting these cards through you at any time. You can just hold them up, and the staff around the room will come over and grab those from you. And we will incorporate these questions into our conversation with Diane and Josh. Near the end of the session, we will also open up the microphones in the center of the room, and we invite you to come up to the microphones. Handouts of these presentations and other related materials are already available on NCSL's Legislative Summit Resources page online. And we would like to remind everyone to please speak into the microphones because of the cameras in the room and the streaming. And finally, we would like to thank the Pew Charitable Trust for their support of the NCSL Pension Track, which consists of this session and the following session, which will be in the next room, and I'll give information about that location at the conclusion of the session. So at this time, please join me in welcoming Ms. Diane Oakley to the podium. Or do you want to do this?
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be back at NCSL, but also to bring this topic back to NCSL. In 2009, NERS did a presentation on cost efficiencies of defined benefit plans and how they stack up against defined contribution plans. And I'm pleased to tell you that a recent analysis that we did, we revisited the issue, says that there's still a better bang for the buck. This analysis we went through, we updated the methodology to reflect the changing landscape in retirement benefit security. We introduced the concept of having an ideal DC plan. This would be a DC plan with lower fees. And we also reflect the increased use of target date funds as default options. We also looked at the current level of defined benefit investment allocations and longevity improvements. And I'd also say we also looked a little bit at the ability to use annuities in pension plans. Wrong way. Just to give you a quick start on what we do in the analysis, we target a monthly income for teachers who are going to be retiring of $2,700 at age 62. And we compare how that benefit was provided at what cost in 3 different plan designs. The first one is defined benefit plans. Typical asset allocations in defined benefit plans and typical fees are incorporated into that decision. and discussion, and we find that it costs roughly about 16.3% of pay. That's the lowest little bar on the far side. Then we look at an individually directed plan, and here we base it on the fact of using a target date fund that mixes annuities and equities and gradually adjusts along a glide path those investment allocations based on recommendation by financial planners. We look at average fund fees, and then we incorporate something called behavioral drag at a modest level. Behavioral drag is how do investors act and invest their money when they have choice. And then we look at an ideal plan that some individuals have suggested. Here we're going to use the target date fund, but we're also going to assume that it's going to get the same exact returns on each of those asset allocations that the DB plan would get, and that the fund levels would be the same as those in the DB. But the difference here would be that there would be no individual choice for participants. And it comes down to really three key reasons on why there's a cost advantage for DB plans compared to DC plans. That is the pooling of longevity risk among large numbers of participants enables the plan to plan for the average life expectancy without understanding that anybody's going to run out of money. We also look at maintaining an optimally balanced portfolio rather than having to adjust that portfolio as you do on a target date fund over someone's career path and also then into retirement. And then finally, the other advantage is the investment returns tend to be higher when they're made by professionals because individual investors have shown that behavioral patterns that our behavioral economics professionals have identified pretty clearly, and then we look at lower fees. I'm going to go through each one of these individually. First of all, longevity pooling. And again, DB plans can fund based on the average life expectancy of everyone in the pool. So we look at each individual participant and we can fund for their life expectancy, and you know the plan will take care of mortality risk. An individual who would either be doing this on their own has to be concerned about not running out of money. And if they target their drawdown of an annuity or a lifetime income from that defined contribution account, they actually will have a 50-50 shot of running out of money if they just do longevity. And so it's important for them to do something beyond that and accumulate more in savings or then purchase an annuity, which might require a higher balance to do that. The average life expectancy under the assumptions we're using is age 90 for a teacher, and the 80th percentile, which is what we're doing on the self-insuring, gets somebody to age 97. To get a balance that's going to last until age 97, an individual would have to save $600,000 instead of $500,000 at retirement to be able to do that. And that means instead of a 16.3% of pay, it would cost that individual 19.6%. Now, some people suggest you can purchase an annuity, and I'll talk about this a little bit shortly in the next slide. The other strength is this ability to maintain portfolio diversification. Most investments in a defined benefit plan, all of the investments are pooled in one account, and the actuaries can very accurately predict the cash flow needed in those accounts. And so they can understand and diversify those investments with a long-term horizon and a pretty consistent allocation pattern. Individuals in the target date fund, and by its design itself, gradually move away from risk and into more conservative investments. This means that these funds have a gradual reduction in the rate of return. And you can see that if you look at the performance of life cycle funds. Typically, you're going to see a highest rate of return for the furthest out and the lowest rate of return for the one that's most closest to people getting in retirement. And when we look at the impact of that on cost, what we find is that an individual needs now $700,000 if they're going to get that same $2,700 income based on protecting for longevity and adjusting for the fact that in that target date fund, what it also happens is at the time when you have the most amount of money to invest for retirement, you're getting the lowest level of return. And so that has an impact. Now, if we look at it at this point, we're talking about what we would call the ideal plan. The individual has a target date fund, the same expenses. It's about a 29% more than the DB plan and about 23% of payroll. If you were to use the money to buy an annuity from an insurance company, instead of adjusting for longevity risk, we've looked at those numbers. And so you have a target date fund until you retire, and then at retirement you buy an annuity. If you do that, the cost at today's annuity rates, because the interest rates are very low, would be about 25% of pay. If you do it at more traditional annuity rates, it would be about 20% of pay. So there could be some saving if the rates are attractive in the marketplace, but it doesn't get you back to what the cost would be for the defined benefit plan. The next piece of feature is the fact that you have lower fees and professional management. There's a whole level of history that we've learned with target date funds and investing through behavioral economics. DB plans can pool their investments. They tend to get lower returns in group pricing. So we look at lower fees as one component. The other component is something called participant and behavioral drag of the participants. This is a mix of various things. It's allocating too conservatively, too aggressively, moving money at certain times being the wrong times. It's clearly demonstrated that individual investors move out of investments when the investments are low, and they move into them when they are high. And when you adjust for that, and there's a variety of studies done by CEM benchmarking, Morningstar, Professor Brad Barber, and Odeon. Forbes magazine has done studies, Callan Associates, Dalbar has done studies, and Aon Hewitt have done studies on all of these, are some of the ones that we cite and understand. In fact, if you look at the one from Dalbar did an analysis looking at investments between 1984 and 2002. What they found was that if you invested in an S&P 500 index, you would have gotten a return of about 14%, 14.5%. If you invested in a mutual funds, the return that you would get from mutual funds was 11.5. But individual participants who invested in mutual funds got a return of just 4% in the Dalbar analysis. That's probably one of the studies on the extreme end. And so what we did in NERS when we looked at this study, we took a very conservative look at this, and we assumed a 100 basis point difference, a 1% differential in rate return for the traditional typical DC plan. And what that netted out was that you would actually need then about $800,000 accumulated by age 62 in order to buy that target income level. That equates to about contributing 31% of payroll throughout your career, and that's about 48% more than the DB plan. And in fact, we have a complicated chart that summarizes this up, but the key things to look at here are the 48% savings if you look at everything. If you look at an ideal plan, this is the plan where you would have the efficiencies of the target date fund that we've gotten from behavioral economics, but you would also have the longevity protection, but that would be a 28% savings for the DB, 28% savings over the DB plan would save you over the cost of doing it as a DC plan. But in reality, as states look at possibly making changes to their pension plan, what they know is that costs probably aren't going to increase. And so if the costs remain the same, and you're going to put the same amount of dollars into the plan, whether it's a defined benefit plan, an ideal plan with no participant choice allowed, or an individually directed plan with choice and flexibility to manage those investments left at the individual level, the level of benefits then will be lower. And in fact, instead of replacing about 53% of the final pay from the defined benefit plan, the ideal plan would only replace about 38%, and the individually directed plan would replace 28%. The plan has a wide variety of sensitivity analysis in the document, and I have a copy of it up here. In fact, you can get it. It's everything I've talked about, all the assumptions about this are all in this booklet. It's available online, and it's at the end of your paper. There's a link to all the reports I'm going to talk about. If you buy annuities, as I mentioned earlier, you can do them in different environments. It may save you some money over self-insuring. I also want to share with you, because being legislatures, I know sometimes you go and do what they did in Colorado, and you ask one of the agencies in your state to do a study. Colorado legislature mandated that the Colorado Office of the State Auditor do a study, and this is a little bit more weighty. It's a very extensive study. I'm just going to share two charts from the study for it with you. What they did is they did this analysis looking at the benefits from the Colorado Public Employee Retirement System, and they looked at it in two ways. They looked at one and saying, let's deliver the same benefit to the career employee in both systems, and then let's see what the cost will be. The study I've done here is the side-by-side hybrid plan, so it's the DB plan compared to a hybrid plan with a DC type of account. And the cost of that program to deliver the same career benefit would be 160% of the defined benefit cost. If it was a cash balance plan, they go through cash balance, they go through self-directed. Cash balance plan would cost 179%, and the self-directed plan 242%. They also looked at it from another way, which is they said, what happens if we leave the cost the same? And in that case, what we find is that the benefit levels are different. In the side-by-side hybrid, the career employee would have received about 72% from Colorado PARA. Colorado is a state that does not include Social Security for its employees. If the cost was the same, the hybrid plan would only deliver a benefit of about 54.4%. And if you look down for the same dollars at every single different, and they've looked at a various array of work history and positions, at every single one of those levels, the benefits were greater in the DB plan rather than in the hybrid side-by-side. And again, you'll also see if you go into the details of the report, cash balance, side-by-side, cash balance comes out to be 26% instead of 54%. Other things that are important on pensions are why you have a pension. Public sector workforce actually has a difference and is a good place to offer DB plans. There's a strong commitment to stable employment, both in education, police and fire. Experience matters and is important to quality. And the other thing is public employers are not going to go out of business. They're not allowed to declare bankruptcy. So you can vary out over funding cycles. And ultimately, that public interest mission of defined benefit plans do help to provide high-quality public services as a cost-efficient manner while also providing productivity. We know that public workers value their benefits and that they value their work more than private workers. They also tend to invest more in their skills. It's very possible, and economic studies have indicated that moving to a DC design could affect recruitment, retention, and productivity among its workforce. The other important piece is that DB plans encourage efficient retirement. Employees withdraw from the labor force as their productivity declines. We're not seeing the type of job lock that the private sector is starting to find as they've switched from DB plans to DC plans, and older workers are staying in their jobs. It's interesting also to note how important public employees value retirement security plans. We did a survey in March, and what we found was that public sector employees would say that their pension is extremely or very important to them, 88%. When we asked them about salary, we got a very different figure. Only about 57% said it was extremely or very important. And this differs very much from the private sector worker. The private sector worker says employment salary is more important, 82% versus 65%. And the most interesting thing, I think, too, is the public agrees with the workers. They find that defined benefit plans are a good way to recruit and attract public employees, police, and firefighters. And with that, I'll leave you a set of references. All of these in the materials online have links to all the reports I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And now, Josh.
Well, it's great to be here, and I appreciate NCSL for putting on this session, and I look forward to the discussion portion afterwards. I'm going to try to go pretty quickly through this so that we have a lot of time for discussion. I anticipate there will be lots of questions. So you can see from the title of my presentation that I don't quite agree with the analysis that NERS has done. And this is based on some analysis that I did for a forthcoming paper that will be released through the Manhattan Institute next week, next Wednesday. I've got the one day before on there, but it's going to be released next Wednesday. That link will be live next Wednesday. So let's start with some value statements. So everyone who works hard and plays by the rules should have a retirement plan that puts them on the path to retirement security. Retirement benefits are an important and valued part of compensation, and promoting workforce-wide retirement security is a worthy policy goal. I actually think there's tons of common ground on these points. I think that Diane and I fully agree on these points. I don't disagree at all. In fact, in my work at the Foundation, we have supported broad retirement security. We have funded educational research on extension of retirement benefits to private sector workers through the Brookings Institution. We have also directly funded secure choice style plans in California and Connecticut. We are very interested, and I am very interested, in trying to promote workforce-wide retirement security. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. I'm not a person who believes that there is one way to do everything. That's simply not the way I operate. I think there are a variety of ways. I have a tendency to go towards the simpler solution, but at the end of the day, I want well-funded plans that help workers reach retirement security. And there are some simple things that you can incorporate in any plan design to get there. Adequate savings rates, pooled, professionally managed, low-fee, and appropriately allocated investment options, limited lump sums, and favorably priced annuities upon retirement. All of these can be incorporated into any plan design. DB simply does not have a monopoly on these features. Acting as if it does is misrepresenting plan design. So what do the plan categories mean? So I think you all know this. I just included this because often we jump right into a discussion where we say DB and DC, and we don't actually define the terms that we're using. Basically, a DB is a plan where benefits are promised as a percentage of your final salary and is a function of years of service. A defined contribution plan, workers are promised annual contributions, and they're provided investment options and often annuities. Cash balance plan, workers are promised annual employer contributions and a minimum investment return. That, at its base, is what these plan designs are, and there's lots of variation inside each one. So what are the benefits of a cash balance in DC? So I will argue that these are the simplest solutions. So while all plan designs can incorporate important features, these two are the simplest. They're also fair to all workers. They are not, by definition, backloaded. I've written a number of papers that talk about how DB plans are backloaded, and especially at current benefit levels, they actually don't support the retirement security of the entire workforce. Many people leave before ever reaching the promise of a secure retirement. This is especially true in the public sector. They represent the simplest, most transparent models for providing secure retirement benefits. I think this is really important. I know there are a lot of legislators in the room, but to be frank, I think that state legislatures and local city councils have mismanaged pension funds. And they reduce and eliminate the potential for pension debt to undermine public finances. So the myth of DB cost effectiveness. So when governments have considered DCs, it always comes about that various groups come forward and say, you can't do that because you would be offering a worse benefit at higher cost. These groups include leaders of labor, organized labor, current retirement system managers, and the cottage industry of consultants who rely on public DB plans for work. And I'm going to pause right here. There are a lot of studies that have been produced on this topic. Almost all of them, especially 4 states, have been produced by public plan actuaries. Now, public plan actuaries are not disinterested arbiters of truth. They are not truth seekers in the sense that we like to think of people being completely disinterested. They are corporations who rely on public plans for work, and they are not likely to try to endanger their public plan business. So I don't say that to say that you should completely discount what actuaries say or what public plan actuaries say. but rather you should come at this with healthy skepticism, the same kind of healthy skepticism that you would have if a corporation inside your state produced a report that conveniently showed that their business was the best. These groups generally claim that DB plans have inherent advantages. Diane has talked about some of those inherent advantages, and I think NERS has been one of the most vocal perpetuators of this myth. So what is the myth? So the myth is that DB plans offer higher investment returns and annuities, whereas DC plans offer lower investment returns and no annuities. But these claims are not supported by the empirical evidence. They are driven by false assumptions and ignore pension debt, a big cost driver for state plans at the moment. So there's an old joke in economics. Well, it's not really in economics. It's about economists, that where you have a physicist and a chemist and an economist who happen to be on a deserted island. And on that deserted island, there's a bunch of cans of food, but these guys can't eat unless they can get into the food. So they all get together and they say, hey, let's figure out how to get into this food. The chemist and the physicist come up with ingenious ways to get into the cans of food. They look at the economist and they say, what did you come up with? And the economist says, assume a can opener. So this joke has been used to make fun of economists' use of assumptions to drive results. And that's exactly what's happened in this NERS paper. It does not link back to the empirical results of plans. Instead, they simply assume that DC plan returns are lower, that DC plans cannot provide annuities. In the case of a lot of these studies that are at the state level, so for cash balance plans, a lot of these studies assume that the annuitization rate for cash balance plans has to be lower, even though there's direct evidence that you can annuitize at the same rate as your DB plan. So assumptions drive results, and that's the case in the NERS paper. So previous studies, there are a number of previous studies of returns between DB and DC plans. The two most cited are by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College and one by Towers Watson. Their preferred metric for looking at the difference in returns is a dollar-weighted metric. And I argue that this conflates plan size and plan design. In the private sector data, the DB plans are simply larger. And if you look at any plan design, larger plans tend to do better. And so because they're looking at dollar-weighted averages, they skew the results toward DB plans. So and just to kind of illustrate how they're skewed, while less than 0.5% of DB plan assets in the private sector have $5 billion or more, these plans represent, on average, 33% of DB plan assets. So over the period studied, DB plan assets are just skewed heavily towards large plans. I argue that plan-weighted averages provide a better measure of the full variation in plan returns. Conveniently, those are provided in the Towers-Watson and CRR studies. They actually highlight these, but NERS has chosen to use the other numbers. If you look at the differences here, and I've taken what are called geometric averages, so I look at average annual return over the entire period, and I've got about 5 years here for a starting year, just to look at variation over starting year. The last column is what you should pay attention to. If you look at the last column, using CRR and Towers-Watson data, the difference between DB and DC geometric returns is about 0.2 percentage points. Not 1 percentage point, but 1/5 of that. When I look at the private sector data, using the large data set of retirement plans maintained by the DOL, this is what I see. So what I've got here, the bars represent the range between the 90th and 10th percentile of returns, and the dots represent the median. Now there's a lot of information here, and you see here the red are DC plans, the blue are DB plans. What you're supposed to take away from this slide is there is a whole lot of overlap in returns between the two plan designs. If one plan design dominated the other, you would see specifically the DB plans, those bars should be higher almost universally than the DC bars. That's not the case. We see a whole lot of overlap in DB and DC performance, and we've also seen a narrowing of that range over time. Another thing to notice is those dots, the medians for the different plan designs, are always very close together. There's not a large difference between the average annual returns. Here's another way of looking at that same data. So here I've highlighted different parts of the return distribution. So I'm comparing the best DB and DC plans against each other. I'm comparing the worst DB and DC plans against each other. And in the middle, I'm comparing kind of 3 different levels. Now, notice back in the and I'm doing 10-year average returns. So, in other words, instead of just looking at annual returns, I'm looking at what plan members would actually experience over a 10-year period, compounded. So, a couple of things to notice. First of all, so looking up at the blue line, that essentially indicates that the worst DB plans are better than the worst DC plans. They almost continually outperform the worst DC plans. The best DC plans outperform the best DB plans. In the middle, there's not a whole lot of difference, and that difference has shrunk over time. If I apply statistical methods to see if I can actually tell a difference at each point in the return distribution, I can tell a difference at the top and the bottom. I cannot tell a difference between the returns in the middle. There is no distinguishable difference between the returns offered by DC plans and DB plans in the private sector. So fees. Fees is an interesting topic. It's only useful to the extent that it explains a return difference. As I said, there's no real return difference, but it's interesting to kind of talk about fees. So all of these reports generally overstate DC plan fees. NERS happens to both overstate DC plan fees and understate DB plan fees. So this chart is actually taken from a recent report by Brightscope. I've got a link there to it. The takeaway here is that fees for plans of similar size in the DB universe and DC universe are low and in the same range. If you look at this, the medians are highlighted, and you can see the fee range there. It's somewhere between 0.5 and 0.2, a very similar range to DB plans. In fact, if you look at the DB plan average from academic estimates, the mean is about 0.5, is about half a percentage point. But there are outliers. I don't know if anybody here is from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has been much in the news for retirement plans. The governor is asked to move into index funds and away from things like private equity and alternatives. There's very good reason for that. So the Pennsylvania School Employees Retirement Plan has fees that are over 1 percentage point. They're public plan with fees that are over 1 percentage point. So there's huge range in the public sector as well. The point is, for plans of similar size, there's no real difference in fees. Annuities. So I think this is actually probably the kind of broadest misconception about DC plans. DC plans can provide annuities, and they do. In the private sector, there is federal regulation that discourages their use inside private sector DC plans. But we still see a lot of private sector firms providing them. The private sector annuity market is also constrained by state policy. So insurance companies are constrained in what they can invest in. And that's important because it keeps the annuity rates, the rate at which you can annuitize, relatively low. However, these constraints don't pertain to the public sector. In public sector DC plans, you can provide annuities, and almost all of the public sector DC plans that exist do. And many of them provide these annuities at favorable rates, and a few of them provide them at exactly the same rate as they annuitize in their DB plan. There is nothing stopping a state or local government from creating a DC plan that limits investment choice, a DC plan that automatically converts to annuities at the end, and where those annuities are priced the same as their DB plan. This is simply not a constraint. It is an erroneous assumption that is snuck into the NERS paper, and it drives a huge portion of the results. So in the paper, I actually list all the public DC plans. I would encourage you to look at these DC plans, including the federal plan, the Colorado plan, Oregon, Indiana. The list goes on and on. There are 25. And look at the annuity provision under these plans, and look at what the annuity rates are. Lastly, the NERS reports ignore the steep cost of pension debt. This is surprising given that pension debt right now is a huge cost driver in DB plans. If you look across, on average, all plans, and you look at ARC, so you look at annual required contributions into these plans, around 70% of that contribution is going to debt service. Only around 30% of that contribution is going for new benefits for new employees. 70% is going to debt service, to pay down debt. This is a huge cost driver in public plans, and the NERS report, the Colorado report, completely leaves it out as a cost driver in DB plans. There have only been a couple of times in history where DB plans have not been a creditor to state and local government, and kind of de facto public workers haven't been a creditor to state and local government. So if you carry pension debt equal to 70%, equal to 10% of liabilities, it would increase annual cost by around 70%. Carrying a debt equal to 20% of liabilities would increase cost by around 140%. I've got a range of estimates in the paper that talks about, given different rates of return and different levels of debt, what exactly would be the cost of carrying pension debt over time. That might be useful for you to look up exactly how much pension debt you have, what your rate of return is, to figure out kind of what your debt service is going to be in the future. So I've just got a few graphs to kind of illustrate how debt is a cost driver and is likely to be a cost driver going forward. So if you look at total state and local liabilities over U.S. GDP, the size of our promises relative to our economy has increased dramatically over time. So around 1990, the liability, so the size of our promises relative to GDP, was about 10% of GDP. Now it's around 30%. This is not a huge deal. It just means these promises are more leveraged on our economy than they ever have been before, meaning there's less ability for government to pay, and that can cause problematic conflicts when plans have underfunding. Public pension debt is larger than it's ever been. So this is U.S. Public pension debt scaled by GDP, and you can see there that we've come down a little bit from the heights of pension debt relative to GDP, but it's still larger than it's ever been. So the debt load is larger than it's ever been. And what that's resulted in is rising costs. So this is average ARC across plans in the Boston College database. This comes from their recent paper. You can see that costs have increased from 6.7% of pay to 18.6% of pay since 2001. This is a big deal. It's a big cost driver, and the results have been very negative for workers. Workers in almost every state have faced significant benefit cuts, specifically new workers. Benefits for new employees have nearly been zeroed out in a number of places. So in the end, DC plans are an effective way to help all workers reach retirement security. DB plans are not more cost effective. You can design any plan design to be cost effective. That's an important takeaway. What DC plans can do is help simplify benefit promises and hold governments more accountable for appropriately funding those promises. Now quickly, I'd like to go to Colorado. Interestingly, the Colorado report, which Diane said was done by the state auditor. It was actually done by GRS, not the state auditor. The state auditor's office released the report. That's an important distinction. It's an actuarial firm who does lots of public sector work. But they didn't look at the DC plan that Colorado has. So let me just read you a few figures here. So the DB plan, the state division, the normal cost for that plan is 3% of pay. That's the employer normal cost. So in other words, employers are anticipating that they'll have to pay 3% of pay over the working life of an employee to fund their benefit. They're only saving 3% of pay. For the schools division, that's 4.33%. So less than 5% savings rate for employers. I don't know in what universe we live, but that is too low a savings rate, especially if you're not in Social Security. It's a very meager benefit. Guess what the DC savings rate is? The DC savings rate, employer contributions to the DC, 10.15%. Their DC plan knocks it out of the park compared to their DB plan. And guess what? Investment returns have been on par with their DB plan. But the GRS report didn't even consider the well-designed DC plan that already existed in the state. They also provide access to annuities. Now, they do outsource it, but they do get favorably priced annuities by bundling them up and going to an insurance company. But there's nothing stopping them from providing those directly through the state. On the cash balance plan, Colorado also has a cash balance plan. So their benefit structure is a hybrid. It's a hybrid between a traditional DB and a cash balance plan. Guess what the rate they use to annuitize in the cash balance plan? They use the same rate that they annuitize for the DB plan inside the cash balance plan. So the takeaway I want you to have here is you should approach these types of reports with lots of skepticism. Whenever people say that one plan design can't deliver this and another plan design can't deliver that, you should ask real hard questions and try to think about retirement security more than you think about plan design. Thanks.
Well, to begin the question and answer portion, I wanted to give Diane a chance to respond to a couple of things. I know Josh had said that assumptions drive results and that she's chosen to use other numbers in the report, and so I want to open it up and let Diane respond to these.
I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier was the report that we issued called Still a Better Bang for the Buck. Looked at the methodology that we had used in 2008 before we really had a lot of the results that came about from behavioral economics. So at that point in time, we had only the type of data coming from Towers-Watson that showed us that defined benefit plans delivered better returns. The one thing about that is it also doesn't look at the composition of the individuals. And so we thought it was more important, and again, I think Josh has been the person in his early part of his presentation. He talked about an ideal plan. If you look at the ideal plan that we made that comparison to, of buying a plan that will give you an income based on a target date, this is the approach that behavioral economics has given to defined contribution plans as a way of addressing the fact that, according to Aon Hewitt, 2/3 of individuals are too aggressive and 1/3 is too conservative in terms of their investment allocations in their 401k plans. And so when we look at that and we modeled that, what we really found was there was a cost advantage for that and the longevity protection. Josh likes to talk about favorable annuity rates. There are a lot of good rates in terms of annuities, but when the insurance companies are delivering a return based on a portfolio that's entirely related to bonds, the historical rate of return calculated, not by NERS, by the Congressional Research Service of the United States Congress, a nonpartisan organization, they calculated that the historical rate of return underlying fixed annuities was 2.8%. The data, when we look at the data coming out of the public funds report that the Arnold Foundation supports, shows that the real rate of return coming from the diversified portfolios operated by pension plans all around the country is 5.4%. Now, you can buy annuities if you want throughout someone's career and get them a fixed return, have them be guaranteed by the insurance industry, who, by the way, if an insurance company goes belly up, the cost comes back to the taxpayers under the guarantee law in almost every but 4 states. So you can do that, but when you do that, you're giving away over a 70-year period buying insurance company annuities throughout somebody's career. And if you do it with just fixed investments, it would cost you 3 times the amount. I think better bang for the buck makes valid assumptions. All of the assumptions that we have in that paper, including the ones about behavioral drag, are all based on empirical research that has been in many cases peer-reviewed. The research that's been published in many journals around the country in terms of what individuals do with their money when they invest it. This is something that behavior economics has taught us, that sometimes people don't react the way economists do. I don't know if there's any actuaries in the room, but I thought Josh's comment with regard to actuaries didn't take into account the fact that every one of those actuaries is subject to standards of conduct that are set by the Actuarial Standards Board, and that's what they have to deal with. They have professional standards. You require that when you ask them to certify. The federal government requires that when they have to certify private sector pensions. So I think all of that stuff is valid. These are strong things. There are methods. The numbers add up.
Thank you. And I would like to remind everyone that there's the yellow question cards, and NCSL staff are available on both sides of the room to bring these up here. Thank you very much for all these. I'll go ahead and ask one for both of you. So, do individuals make sound investment decisions? What do you make of the following assertion by some researchers? The likelihood of investment success increases as the participants' involvement in the investment decision decreases. What are the related implications for plan design and cost? And we'll have Josh start.
Yeah, that sounds great. So first, another kind of piece of misinformation there. When I say annuity rates, I don't mean that states have to offload annuities to the private sector. I'm saying states can directly provide annuities, and they do in their DC plans. So just to be clear. I totally agree with this statement to a certain extent. I think that individuals have a hard time navigating the vagaries of the market. That's a true statement. However, the question is whether current DC plan design or whether DC plan design on average in the private sector looks like an individual investor picking stocks, bonds, trading in Russian currency, as one of my friends has said in the past. And the answer is no. It's very plainly no. One of the reasons that we've seen that improvement in DC plan returns and no difference in returns for more than a decade now is because DC plan design has moved towards more of an institutional investor model. So if you look at reports, both academic and from industry professionals who provide DC plans, what you'll find now is that most DC plans provide options only of index funds and target date funds, and the majority of new people coming into these funds invest in these fully managed options. There's very little difference between the performance of these types of funds and the performance of large DB plans. There simply isn't. If you look at the empirical results, there isn't. If you look at the results from CRR and Towers Watson, there isn't. So the big point here is that DC plan design can restrict options, can look a lot like the professionally managed, pooled, low-fee investments that we see in the public sector DB plans, and the ideal is a whole lot more common.
We have a whole new area of economics called behavioral economics. And economists have spent a good deal of time looking at this. Also, for example, one of the largest defined contribution plans is the Federal Thrift Plan. The Federal Thrift Plan, which has the lowest cost fees you're going to get, has seen dramatically these type of implications. When the market goes down, individuals switch to quality. And in the Federal Thrift Plan, that means they move into the G Fund. They have not seen what Josh is talking about with individuals moving into target date funds. People will move back and forth because once you give individuals the choice, that level of behavior that is, we don't do the best thing for us. We have an emotional reaction when the markets go down and we seek quality. And at the same time, we are a little bit late on the uptick when the markets are going up and the prices are higher. We make those choices to get in the market and take more risk. And as long as you have plans and you give people choice and you tell them it's their money and it's their account, I will speak from the point of having worked for a company, TIAA-CREF, for 28 years. When I was at TIAA-CREF, they are one of the biggest defined contribution plans. They had very limited choice. Individuals couldn't make some of these investment decisions. And in fact, what happened is there was an outcry on the part of those individuals so that today people in TIAA-CREF have a wide variety of investment choices, and they have that flexibility to do well. They also have the flexibility to hurt themselves. And the economic data is clear and persuasive on this point.
All right, and this question comes from the audience, and it's for both of you. Can you explain the 10-second soundbite? The private sector has moved to defined contribution plans, so why not the public sector? Is it not a good idea? So explain the history of why private sector went to defined contribution and how that does not apply to the public sector. Can you give us a good answer in support of DB versus DC plans, in terms of we know you both have very different assertions on this topic. So, Diane?
Okay, I'll start this one. Basically, the DB plan move away from DB plans in the private sector was driven most significantly by changes in the federal regulation. The federal government regulations, most recently passed in the Pension Protection Act. I was up on Capitol Hill working on that bill as a staff member to a Ways and Means Committee member. I was actually in the room when people were making some of those changes and choices. That bill, when it was passed with an effort to sort of shorten the funding period, reduce the risk. In the private sector, the federal government is the ultimate backstop, or the PBGC is the ultimate backstop guaranteeing those plans. And because the PBGC it has some long-term solvency issues, they decided it was very important to make sure that plans wouldn't be at risk. And so they shortened the amortization period. They reduced the funding interest rate to a bond interest rate and not the rate that the plan earned. They made the volatility of cost something that was untenable to corporations in an environment where their stock value goes up and down with their balance sheet. And so to move away from that, all of that's been driven by changes in federal policy. And some of it is also workforce. There's a very different workforce in many sectors of the private sector. In the technology sector, you don't want an employee who's been with you for 5 years. Their technology skills aren't up to date. You want to have a lot of turnover. You want to encourage your employees to leave. You don't even offer your employees a pension. You offer them a stock bonus plan, or you offer them some type of stock plan. You don't offer them a pension. Look at California, for example. California has one of the lowest levels of pension coverages across the country, and a lot of that is because of the type of high-tech industry that we have in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, thanks. PEPTA, the Pension Protection Act, was in reaction to something. It didn't just come about because people on Capitol Hill were thinking, hey, we've got to pass something. We all know that the federal government isn't really interested in passing things. It was in reaction to terrible behavior by corporations prior to this. Alicia Munell has called the private pension world prior to PEPTA the Wild West because there were no funding requirements. People did what they want. The PBGC was on the hook for huge amounts, and workers, quite frankly, were getting the short end of the stick. So corporate raiders would come in, and they would view overfunded pensions as part of the balance sheet. They would cash that out as equity for the firm in transactions. Bad behavior by corporations was why PEPTA was passed. It's important to remember this whenever you look at the public sector. Right now, we have the biggest level of pension debt we have seen in this country because of bad behavior of state legislators in funding their plans. That's a big deal. That's big to remember. There are lots of parallels here.
So really, speaking on funding levels, I have a related question for you, Josh. So defined benefit plans have gotten into trouble over time because governments have, in many cases, failed to keep up with their share of contributions. What's to stop these public defined contribution plans from running into the same thing? Could the government simply not make the full contribution that they are supposed to be making?
Well, I mean, it's impossible to hold legislatures to their promises because you can't bind future legislatures. You all know that. So the problem is where the consequences fall and how easy it is to deal with those consequences. So in these public plans, we have essentially set up a system where the folks who sponsor can perpetually underfund benefits. I have argued, and I think it's right, that and they make lots of funding decisions. They have a budget. You get a bill for the pension fund, and there's a lot of other stuff that you have to weigh that against. And in recent years especially, the pension fund has gotten short shrift. And so that's led to a big debt. But whenever it comes time to actually pay back that debt, both the public, the legislature, and people who look at this often attribute too much of that to the pension system. So what we've seen is workers have borne disproportionately in the cost of dealing with pension debt. You can't forget that in 49 out of 50 states, benefits have been cut since the financial crisis. That's a big deal, and that debt has fallen most hard on the newest generation of public workers. Their benefits in many states, including Illinois, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, have nearly been zeroed out. Their savings rate, their employer contribution to the new tier of benefits is very close to zero in a lot of circumstances. This is not a good circumstance for workers.
Thank you, and we'll do one more, and then we'll go to the audience there. This is for Diane. If a defined benefit plan is closed to new employees, what happens to investment strategies as time goes on? How does the defined benefit plan continue to pay the remaining pensions?
Thank you, Luke. You know, it was interesting. Josh had a slide up on pension liabilities as a percent of GDP. The one thing he forgot to show you on that slide was that pensions in the public sector are substantially pre-funded. They're not fully pre-funded in most cases, but they're substantially pre-funded. And in fact, for those liabilities, which are at a certain level, there's assets of about 74% to meet those liabilities. So that the real difference between that is the unfunded piece. So again, in most plans, even if they were to close, there are assets available in those plans. There are new assets that have to come into them. But when we look at, for example, plans that have closed, and I'm looking specifically at Alaska. Alaska is a DB plan that was closed in 2000, I believe it was 5 or 3, sometime around there, 5. And what happened in Alaska is they closed the plan. There was a lot of debate. There was a sense that if we close the plan, we're doing something to help the funding. And so what Alaska did when they closed their plan, they subsequently, in the following years, they actually cut back on their amount of contributions. So that the unfunded liability that was $5 billion today is $11.6 billion. And that when you look at that as a percent of the active employees in that plan, because there's fewer active employees in those programs, that plan as a percentage of it is a huge number when it comes to payroll. You know, I've heard this assumption, I will call it something a myth. I don't mean to do that, but I will. And that is that, you know, if you stop a DB plan, you've improved the funding. It's like, you know, I've heard people say, well, when you're in a hole, you have to stop digging. Well, if you lose the backfill coming into your hole, the hole only gets worse. Because if you haven't shored up that hole in the ground, it's going to keep on getting worse. And I think that's been what's been proven with what happened in Alaska, the same type of situation. If you look at another plan that's only 60%, one of the worst funded plans is Michigan plan that's closed. They closed the plan in West Virginia. They noticed that happened. You know, the interesting thing is once they reopened that plan, they also had participants across the state who argued and made sure legislators were going to fund that plan. And, you know, West Virginia took a bold effort when they had a new source of money with the tobacco settlement. They took a plan that historically, from before the time ERISA was passed, was underfunded and pretty much operated on a pay-as-you-go system. And they've now taken that plan that was 20% funded. It's now almost 50+% funded. That's a huge plus and a huge difference. So it really can happen, and you can get well-funded plans. You just have to make the commitment.
And we'll, right here at the front microphone, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Steve Hill. I have a question for Diane. I'm curious about the response to your report from experts in the field, because we heard that we should be skeptical. And we should be skeptical of the actuaries and the Department of Labor and Towers Watson and you and the Boston College Center for Retirement Research. So it sounds like most of the people who participate in this space would not be surprised by your results. So I'm wondering if you could, like, how controversial is it among the experts who study this about better bang for the buck for DB pensions?
Well, the NERS paper and the new methodology, when we developed it with a panel of actuaries, investment experts, individuals who were economists, people in public pension systems, and we also had it reviewed by a number of other individuals. So we had an active panel of people who put this together. This is not just NERS. Now, Josh may dispute that because we used individuals who were public plan actuaries, and that's what we did in the value of it. It sets up a structure. It looks at it. I think it's a valid thing. I think the numbers do add up.
So can I have a quick response to that? So this is great, but I didn't say you should be skeptical of all of those organizations. In fact, I used Towers Watson and CRR's results to demonstrate that they don't actually show there's a big difference. If you want to see some academic published peer-reviewed articles that are kind of a reaction to this belief, you can go to the link section of mine. There's one by Amashir, and his reaction was the dysfunctional DB-DC debate. I completely agree with this. Then there's another one recently by now the Dean of the Business School at the University of Illinois, Brown, and it looks kind of in-depth at the actual empirical results in plans. And so I would direct you to the end of my slide deck.
And we have a number of these reports linked to from the Summit Resources webpage, and we're happy to put more links to the reports provided by both of our panelists on that webpage as well so that you can take a look at these reports yourself. And we'll go to the back microphone now.
State Senator Steve Conway, State of Washington, on my pension committee, been there forever. I have a few. I actually like the methodology in this study because I think we need to have a methodology to get pension security issues. I think, what does it take in a defined contribution plan to deliver a $2,700 annuity per month for a person? And if I look at this methodology, and I went online, while you were talking, I went online to look at it. It seems like, I see here on DB plan, it takes about a $504,000 fund of some sort to pay for that benefit. With the ideal defined contribution plan, it looked like $700,000 you needed to have in a defined contribution plan. And then I looked at the final one. I won't go into it because I think those two are illustrative of my question. My question is that, it seems like the data is suggesting you can deliver a better benefit under a defined benefit plan, and I don't see anything in your figures that suggested otherwise. You didn't look at that how do we deliver a $2,700 benefit to a teacher? Do we do it better through a defined benefit plan, or do we do it easier through a defined contribution plan? That's a pretty empirical question to me. And it looks to me like the result says DB delivers it for the very reasons that Ms. Oakley indicated. And I might point out on your statement about actuaries, in our state, Washington State, one of the better funded plans in the country, uses a review of our actuarial assumptions all the time as well. So we are going outside our actuaries to ensure that the assumptions we're using are accurate. So I didn't like your comment about actuaries because actuaries themselves like to see a review of their own assumptions. So I just asked those questions of you in particular because I think this is great. We need to figure out which one will deliver a $2,700 benefit because we are about pension security here, and that should be our objective. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. That was great. And Washington has a well-managed plan. So first of all, dealing with the comment about actuaries, I didn't say actuaries are terrible. Those weren't words that came out of my mouth. I said that you should apply scrutiny to their work. And it sounds like in Washington that you apply a lot of scrutiny to the actuaries' work. That's great. The Actuarial Standards Board just had meetings to figure out if they should update their actuarial standards. And part of this was driven by the larger actuarial community looking at results in the public sector and saying maybe we should narrow our standards a little bit to be a little more prescriptive. They were considering that. So I didn't say actuaries were terrible. I just said they're not unbiased arbiters of truth. I said that you should apply scrutiny to their results. Second of all, I think that there is not a whole lot wrong with the NERS calculations. I didn't say that NERS calculation that they incorrectly did mortality or they incorrectly calculated the benefit that would be delivered. I said it was based on incorrect assumptions that don't match empirical results. And whenever you do calculations like this, the assumptions that you base it on matter. There are two big assumptions that they make that place a heavy thumb on the scale in favor of DB plans. One is the return assumption. Two is the annuity assumption, which are demonstrably false using actual empirical results, real-world results, practical results from public plan DC plans.
And we'll go to the front microphone.
Thank you. Steve McCarter, representative from Pennsylvania. If I could, Josh, could you give us a little more detail about how Pennsylvania cut its benefits for its workers to zero that you just mentioned a minute ago?
Yeah, so Pennsylvania is an interesting place, and I'm sure that you know more than I on this, and I'm happy to have a back and forth on this. But they did cut benefits pretty substantially in Pennsylvania. They did not cut benefits as substantially as Illinois did, where their normal cost is approaching zero for the new tier of benefits under their own estimates. And this has been a topic of conversation pretty heavily. Now, Pennsylvania does have a big unfunded liability that is a big debate in the state legislature, and it was because of that underfunding and rising costs that benefits were cut. My contention is that you can't pretend like that underfunding is not a big deal whenever it's having direct implications for new workers and pretty substantial implications for new workers. I would be interested to know the percentage cut in benefits in Pennsylvania.
Well, the percentage was approximately 25% back in Act 120 in 2010, which is substantially different than zero. And so I want to make sure that, again, as we make assumptions here and we talk about the nature of assumptions, that we make correct statements. Secondly, as defined contribution plans that have been proposed in Pennsylvania to replace defined benefit plans, we're looking at a 75% cut for new employees. Now that's a difference, in a sense, substantially here, and with no guarantee or no money to pay down the debt that exists. And out of those defined contribution plans, in fact, money would still be taken, just as you mentioned, from future employees under a defined benefit plan to also address that issue, to get to the assumptions that it would save $10 billion over 30 years. So there's a lot of ways to look at the numbers. And I think we're all doing that in terms of the way in which we make the assumptions as to where we're going. But your point also was that there is, even assuming that there's only a 0.2% difference in performance, that is hardly a reason to move from a defined benefit plan, which has been, and again, if we assume that states had made their contributions in the way in which they should have, and we wouldn't have the debt, that they would perform any differently than a defined contribution plan that you're advocating that leaves us, with substantially less benefit and substantially less guarantee.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment a lot. So and I actually agree with a lot of what you said. At the end of the day, what we should all be about are well-funded plans, and states have shirked their responsibility for funding benefits, and that's a big deal. I'm not an advocate, as you say, of DC plans. I'm simply trying to tell the truth about the fact that it could be an option, and you can design DC plans well to help people reach retirement security. And if you look at empirical results in the real world, not modeled results based on an assumption, you see that DC plans, by and large, are working well. Now, I don't know a whole lot about the DC plan that was proposed in Pennsylvania, but, a poorly designed plan is a poorly designed plan, regardless of the plan design. West Virginia is a great example of a place that moved to a DC plan and did a bad job designing it. They had done a terrible job managing their DB plan before. They had done bad with both plan designs. Does this mean that both plan designs are terrible and we should jettison them? No, we should strive to be better. We should strive to have fully funded plans that support retirement security, and defined contribution plans are an option in there.
Let me just add one thing to that. And Josh has talked about annuities and fair pricing, and favorable pricing. Again, favorable pricing means the taxpayers picking up the tab for mortality and longevity. And in fact, Josh had mentioned 3 states specifically that he said allow people to buy the benefits. He was talking about Ohio, Indiana, and Washington. Those 3 states, Washington is the one state that allows the individuals to buy the benefit at the rate that the plan provides. That is a substantial benefit. If in the state of Washington, if somebody gives $100,000 to the retirement system, they get a benefit that will provide them $600 and $625 a month for the rest of their life, that will increase by 3% per year. That's the benefit and that's the cost for it. If they go into the marketplace and from a private insurer try to buy that benefit with the same $100,000, there's a limited number of insurance companies that will give you an increasing annuity. TIA-CREF and model that Josh likes to talk about isn't one of them because they don't provide that type of benefit option. But you can only buy it, and what you would get if you were a female is you would get $409 instead of $625. So you'd get 50% less, or you get 50% more if you buy the annuity from the state. Interestingly enough, less than 6% of the individuals in the state of Washington who retire actually choose to buy that annuity from the state. Most of them take the benefit as a lump sum and use it to have some flexibility in terms of their cost. So you can do that. It is a possibility, but that's pretty similar to where most DC plans are. Individuals do not buy annuities. Annuities have a strong sense of economic support, and they make a lot of economic sense. The problem is the American people don't understand them. And they don't understand them because they're one of the least transparent financial services instruments you can buy. You will not know what your money will be earning if you buy an annuity unless you're an actuary. Because the only way the PBGC calculates and publishes an interest rates in annuities is they get quotes of the payout rates from insurance companies, and they have to have an actuary figure out what the underlying interest rate is. Insurance companies won't even disclose to you that one really important clarification.
So, but just to clarify, I actually agree that annuities are really important, and I agree that there's a lot that can be done to improve the private sector annuity market. I'm in full agreement with Diane on that, and I agree that also the insurance industry has done a lot to make these things opaque, and we should really talk about policy options for improving that. We have funded policy options for research into trying to improve the annuity market in the private sector. That's a big deal. But to be clear, from a policy perspective, so states right now have opened up lump sum options in their DB plans as well, and take-up rates are actually increasing there. From a policy perspective, states truthfully can do whatever they want in terms of payout options. They can require, no matter what the plan design, they can require everybody to purchase an annuity. They can favorably price that annuity. The annuity has, the provision of annuity, the pricing of annuity, the payout option has nothing to do with the plan design. You can incorporate all of these features in either plan design from a policy perspective. It is simply incorrect to say that you can't.
It comes at a cost.
Would you be in favor, Josh, of a defined contribution plan design that required all of the employees to annuitize at retirement?
I'm in favor of requiring some level of annuitization. I think that, it is also this loss of flexibility should not be downplayed either. I think the reason we see take-up rates of some lump sum options is because people want the flexibility to consume more early in retirement when they have the energy to do stuff, they have grandkids. There are lots of reasons to think, good, wholesome reasons to think that people would want a little bit more early on, and fully annuitizing is probably not optimal for everybody. But yeah, I'd be in favor of restricted lump sum options inside DC plans, and you can do that.
And would you both agree that a defined benefit plan can be designed well, or it could be designed poorly? And the same thing is true of a defined contribution plan. You could create one that is designed well, and you can create one that's designed poorly. Do you both agree? It's in the details, correct?
I fully would agree with that. I think that you can do either one well or either one poorly. Totally agree with that.
I totally, and again, it's going to also depend on what can you afford and how do you get the best benefit for that.
Now, I disagree with that. You can deliver the same benefit at the same cost. You can design either one to deliver the same thing. There's this belief out there that there's magic. And, whenever I hear things that sound like magic, the the world doesn't include magic. You can't say you put money in one side and out the other end comes unicorns. That just doesn't happen, right? There's actual dynamics of how this happens. DB plans invest in the exact same market that DC plans do. DB plans have shifted towards equities, towards private equity. There are real questions right now whether DB plans are chasing returns by investing too heavily in very risky assets that are hard to value. So there are real questions about the investment practices in DB plans, and those are valid questions. But there's no magic here. They're invested in the same market. Annuities are the same. Annuities are great. We should provide this type of insurance product to employees. But there's no magic with a DB plan that allows you to provide annuities. You can provide annuities regardless of the plan design. Same with savings rate. Savings rate is important. It's important that you save enough for retirement to reach retirement security. There's not some magic system where you can save 3% and end up with a secure retirement. It doesn't exist in the world. There is no magic.
And I do apologize. I know we've not gotten to all the questions. We're going to take one question from the back microphone, and that will conclude the questions for this. And I want to let you know that we do have your questions if you wrote them down, and we have the contact information for both Diane and Josh on both of their PowerPoints available online, and I know either one of them is happy to converse with you on these topics. So for the final question.
Sure, thank you. And are we on?
There you are.
There we go. I'm tempted to make a Harry Potter joke about magic and muggles, but I'm not going to do it. I do want to say that one point of agreement that I'm hearing from you all is that this is really about retirement security, and I completely and totally agree with that, and I'm glad that we're bringing that to the forefront because sort of one of the underlying themes here today seems to be that the reason that plan features are what they are because they work well, right? So you can take classical DB features like annuitization, like pooled investments, and you can use them in a DC plan. And I think that what we're hearing is that those classical DB features should be used for DC plans too because they work. The issue here to me is less about cost, although that's a conversation that we should have, and it's more about risk. It's more about who bears that risk. And when I hear you all talk about the state bearing the risk versus the employee bearing the risk, my question is, who's better prepared? Because to me what this is saying is if I go with the 401k, the state has less risk up front, but far more risk down the line. And can you quantify that, or can you talk to why it's better to shift the risk to the employee rather than the state?
And if you could please keep your responses brief. I know we have the next pension
10 minutes
session.
or so, is it okay?
We have the next pension session in about 12 minutes in a different room.
So I appreciate this question very much, and I think risk is a big deal. My contention is that it is false to say that public DB plans have protected workers from risk. I think if you look at the trends in the last few years, so I showed the trend on cost. If you go on NCSL's website and look up pension legislation, over the last more than decade, there hasn't been a whole lot of increases in benefits. There have been a whole lot of decreases in benefits. Benefit cuts for everybody. New workers, current workers, retirees, benefit cuts that these people never planned on and that are the direct result of underfunding in their pension plans. That risk flowed right through to them. So going back to my magic statement, there's no magic around risk. DB plans don't make risk go away, and they don't offload risk to other people. We've seen over the last more than a decade, this risk has come back to hurt a lot of workers, and that's a big deal. We just should keep that in mind whenever we talk about risk. And I think we need to have a more full discussion about risk and whether we can hold governments accountable for appropriately funding these plans.
I guess I would say ever since public pension plans have been founded, and that goes back over 100 years, there has always been this concept of shared risk and shared cost. Public pensions initially and have continually been a situation where both employers and employees contribute to these plans. So there's been a cost sharing, there's been a sharing of risk. And I think that has, it depends on how much and how far you're going to shift the risk. If you go fully to a defined contribution plan, the risk, as the private sector has done, shifts almost entirely to the individual. And I think what we know is when we're talking about investing, and we're talking about investing and being long-term, we see clearly that public pensions have been able to deal with that risk, deliver to the taxpayers a return that enables the cost of those plans to come primarily from the investment earnings. They don't come from participants. They don't come from taxpayers. It comes from the return that those assets, when they're pre-funded, get to. If you don't fund them in the beginning, as Josh says, and I agree entirely with it, you don't have the assets to get that investment return. But if you do have the pre-funding, we can work to have the markets take and give a return that can help everybody get a secure retirement.
Thank you, and I want to let everyone know that the next Pension Track session, Rolling Out State Cash Balance Hybrid and Defined Contribution Plans, starts at 3:30 in room 3AB, so down on the 3rd floor. And with that, please join me in thanking our two panelists for this robust debate today.